folks would like or need an access copy of the slides, we've got a QR code and a short link that I also just put in the chat. So slides in all of the many different modalities that folks might need. So the first thing that we want to just acknowledge, while we are the two people on the call, this project is the product of many hands, including folks that are not on this slide and folks that are not on this call. We also want to give a special shout out to our Notre Dame colleague, Clint Carlson, who is a professional designer. Our slides would not look like this if we didn't have him on the team. So credit where credit is due for making things look better than we would get there on our own. So by way of kind of how we're going to move through our presentation, we'll talk a little bit about the background of the project and some of the work that's happened to date. Greg is going to do a deep dive on some of the more recent research we've been doing on a Black women's softball barnstorming team. We'll talk a little bit about how that work is getting out into the community and where we're going next. And we're really excited to just have this conversation space with you all. So by way of a little bit of background on the project, a team of folks that predates Greg and I started thinking about kind of access to baseball in South Bend, specifically looking at our public parks and our urban core, recognizing the lack of facilities in general, especially the lack of facilities for elementary school teams, middle school teams, even junior high teams, students who are in our Boys and Girls Clubs programs. So folks who have not been to South Bend, this is our Southeast Neighborhood Park. It has large green surfaces, but nothing that was kind of cared for in a way that would allow for even kind of pick up impromptu playing. A few folks on the team who I would describe as farmers and dreamers had the idea of what if we put a baseball field here? And the last couple years have been convening partners to think about what that's going to look like. And as soon as you convene partners who include historians and people that are deeply connected with our local cultural heritage ecosystem, it's a little tough to see, but that backfield, kind of the outfield wall is actually a train track. So we got a retaining wall there. Folks started to think about how could we use that as a space to tell stories about local history. So again, design renderings, not ones that we created, but thinking about the way that art and public art could create space for different kinds of stories. So lots of different partners involved in the project. We were successful with our first kind of round of fundraising to get the physical field built. But what Greg and I really latch onto is that local history, public history, community archives piece of it. Many folks on this call may know John Kovach, a long kind of friend of women's baseball and friend of this group. We're really indebted to his work. He quite literally wrote the book Baseball in South Bend and has been a longtime advocate of and for women's baseball. So John's work kind of finding some of these images and stories and threads laid the foundation for what we've been able to build on. So just very grateful for John and his work. A lot of kind of the stories that we're telling start with single images. So the team that the field is named for was a predominantly Black team that played in an industrial league out of our Studebaker factory, starting with an image, an unlabeled image, but thinking through what other kinds of sources help us tell that story. One of the courses I teach at Notre Dame is a course on baseball and American history and culture. For the last couple iterations, we've connected that to the Foundry Field project. So students have gotten to do experiential learning out in the community, asking these questions of how do we tell different kinds of baseball stories? What do we need to know to be able to do that? Students have used different kinds of tools and methods to think about context, to think about who played on these teams, to help put those stories in context. But a really big piece of the project is how can we use tools from art and design to get those stories out into the community. So our colleagues who's not on the call has taught courses thinking about visual identity, branding systems, but also arts education and creative placemaking. So our, again, design colleagues have been thinking about what does it look like to get this history and these stories into curriculum that students in our community interact with. And we've got this vision of what if every Boys and Girls Club students in our county learned about different kinds of baseball and softball histories and stories. We're not there yet, but thinking about how students can learn about local history, learn some art and design skills, but also make things that exist out in the community. There's also been all sorts of serendipitous connections where programming that we've done has surfaced living descendants and family members, so we could tell stories for hours. But a big piece of it is programming, but also public art. So a couple years ago, we were able to do the first large mural installation. Again, thinking about where education is part of that, where artists can be talking to students, where students can be also creating art. and making art. So these are the kind of artwork that came out of the workshop that we've done at the Boys and Girls Club that are now on the wall next to art by professional muralists. They tag their art, which is one of my favorite things because many of the students live in the neighborhood, so they come back around. And this was from 2 years ago, our official groundbreaking. So we do have a field. The grass has been killed, new grass has been put in. It's very exciting. We did a couple of pitch, hit, and run clinics this summer with the Boys and Girls Club. We had our first 3-inning game 2 weekends ago, 10 days ago. And so that's kind of the last couple of years of what we've been working on, but I want to hand it over to Greg, who's going to talk about a body of research that we've been working on more recently that we think is definitely going to be of interest to this group. Take it away, Greg.
I'm not seeing the arrows to advance the slides, Katie.
I tried, just tell me when.
Yeah, you may have to roll with it. So thanks, Katie. As Katie mentioned, the Foundry Field project, from the beginning, we've tried to integrate history and story in addition to being a place for playing baseball, a place for playing softball. On the railroad wall that Katie talked about, from the beginning, we envisioned the scoreboard on the bottom is aspirational. We're not there yet, but the training wall, the retaining wall of the train, we have the Foundry Giants mural that Katie talked about, the community art that Katie talked about, and the next space over is Uncle Bill's, the African American women's softball team. We'll be talking about a lot today, both some community art and a mural about Uncle Bill. So this is Uncle Bill's. Went by many names over the years. So colloquially, shorthand, we know it as Uncle Bill's. It was founded, or this version is the Hydrox Cola Girls from 1938. Uncle Bill, his name was Ernest Harris. We went by Uncle Bill. He's on the right side of the picture. We'll hear a lot about him later. This is a very important picture that will come up again and again in the presentation. So next slide, Katie. So we can date Uncle Bill's to the early 1930s. They first start showing up in the regional African American press, the South Bend Tribune, the local newspapers in the early 30s. Interestingly, as you can see in the upper left-hand article, they come out of the Studebaker Athletic Association. They seem to have similar origins of the Foundry Giants, the African-American men's baseball team, coming out of these industrial sports leagues that were very prominent, very popular in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. They're getting covered in the Defender, the regional, everyone knows Chicago Defender, paper of record of one of the papers of record of the African-American community nationwide. The South Bend Tribune, they first start showing up in the following year, the 1930s. From the beginning, they're traveling around the region. They go to this tournament in Chicago associated with the World's Fair. We haven't found out a lot about what happens at the softball tournament in the World's Fair, but they're playing around the region from the beginning. Next slide, Katie. Uncle Bill is very successful at getting sponsorship for the team from the beginning, to help sponsors, to help pay for equipment, to help pay for travel costs. This is an amateur team, at best a semi-pro team. The women are playing around their jobs in their spare time. So Uncle Bill is able to find mainstream white-owned businesses to sponsor the team in South Bend. The first sponsor we saw on the previous screen, their name was the Sailor Girls, after Sailor Furniture Company in downtown South Bend on Michigan Street, right in downtown South Bend. Their second sponsor in the late 30s was a beverage distributor. They were the Hydrox Cola Girls from 38 through the early 40s. So I think it tells us something interesting about the reception of this African-American women's softball team, that businessmen are willing to associate their businesses and their products with this barnstorming Black women's softball team to get their name out in the region in a way we might not expect them to do in the 1930s. As I said, from the beginning, they're playing around the region. Here, they're playing a team at Kellogg's up in Battle Creek, about an hour, 90 minutes away, 60, 90 minutes away. But they're also interesting playing teams in South Bend. They're playing, it seems, mostly white teams. They play a black team from Gary, some other African-American teams. But most of their opponents seem to be white teams. And in the South Bend softball scene, interestingly, in 1938, the Cleveland Yum Yum Pretzels come to town. They're a nationwide barnstorming team. They're one of the national champions in softball in the 1930s, late 1930s. They come to town, and the women's softball team scene in South Bend puts together an all-star team, the Hoosier Beer All-Stars, to play the Yum Yum Pretzels. And I know you can't really see it in this clipping here, but one of the pitchers tapped for the team is Mabel Washington, who played for the Hydrox Cola Girls. And one of the catchers on the team was Ida Pompey, who was a catcher who played on Uncle Bill's for most of its existence. So again, interesting, somewhat integrated spaces in South Bend around the softball scene, around the African American and the women's softball teams. Next slide, Katie. So as you might imagine, I'm sure this crowd is very familiar with an African American team traveling around the Midwest in the 1930s, 1940s is not very easy. The common difficulties you might imagine. This is from a fantastic oral history. Doris Grady is 101 years old. She's still alive. She lives in Ocala, Florida, the last surviving member that we know of Uncle Bill's. We had the great privilege, Katie and I, with some of our colleagues, doing an oral history with her back in the spring of this past year. Her mind is very sharp. She walks every day. Her daughter is 80 and plays softball every week. Life goals for all of us. But Doris Grady was talking about her experience traveling around with Uncle Bill's playing softball. And we'll hear it in her own words.
Like when we traveled, we couldn't go into the, even like in the port, like you couldn't go, if we wanted to eat, we had to go to the back door to get the sandwiches. You couldn't eat dinner like that, like when we was traveling.
Mm-hmm.
And then we couldn't stay. That's the reason we rode in the cars. We traveled in the cars, and we couldn't stay in the hotels. So it's like when we went to Ohio, we had to stay into a funeral home.
Again, very familiar history to those of us who looked at this era, but sounds great for 101. I hope I am that coherent and have that much energy at 101. 1938 was an important year for Uncle Bill's. The team's been around since about 32. The first generation of players are getting older, getting married, having children, finding full-time jobs. So to make the team sustainable, Ernest Harris, Uncle Bill, recruits a new generation of players. He goes to South Bend Central High School, recruits 3 sophomores, juniors, Renalda Boswell, Doris Grady, Annie Weatherspoon, 3 friends who are very good athletes, to make the team an ongoing, continuing force in the community. We don't, unfortunately, have a lot of primary sources. Those of you who've looked at both African-American topics and women's history topics know that they don't always rise to the mainstream recognition as much as they should. Here's a picture of Renalda Boswell from the South Bend Central High School interlude yearbook. She definitely was going places, as we will see. Her classmates Doris and Annie don't seem to show up in the yearbook, and there aren't a lot of other sources, unfortunately, about the players outside of the print media we found. Next slide, Katie, please. So this project's a lot about storytelling, and we're indebted, of course, to the first generation of storytellers. The old saw is that journalism is the first rough draft of history. South Bend has no minor league baseball team in the 1930s, no professional team. So the Foundry Giants and the Studebaker Athletic League is among the best baseball in town. They're all over the sports pages. But also Uncle Bill's, the Hydrox Cola Girls, they get more coverage than you might expect in a reasonably sized city for the white daily newspaper, just because they're among the best athletes in town. And then, of course, we're forever indebted to the journalists at the African American newspapers, the Indianapolis Recorder, Indiana's newspaper of record. Of course, we all know and love the Chicago Defender. Can't do historical research in this era without the Defender. Another reason we know a lot about this team, South Bend, like many mid-sized cities, had a segregated news column they printed not every day, but several times a week, called In Colored Circles. And the first editor of In Colored Circles, the first African-American hired by the South Bend Tribune, was Etta Boswell. You might recognize the name Boswell. That was Renalda Boswell's mother, writing In Colored Circles. So even before her daughter plays in the team, she's writing about Uncle Bill's because it's an important part of the community. And after her daughter and her teammates are playing on the team, she continues to writing about it. So again, we kind of have an embarrassment of sources in some ways for a team like this, just because of the nature of the media in South Bend at the time. Next slide, Katie. And this picture, you'll see it again and again, foundational source for this project. Like for the Foundry Giants, this project started with this picture reprinted in John Kovach's book of Uncle Bill's. It's really the one non-textual, non-printed source we've found so far about the team. Fortunately, this isn't the Defender. They go to Chicago to play some teams in 1938. And thankfully, the Defender identifies the players so we can point to Doris Grady and Renalda Robinson in this picture in a way we can't identify the people in the Foundry Giants. But this is just a foundational source for this project. We're hoping the more we talk about it, the more research we do, we're fingers crossed that we'll find someone with a scrapbook in an attic, a photo album in a basement, so we can tell the story in the way it deserves to be told. But for now, this source is just so important for us. Uncle Bill is the consistent through thread of this team. He owns a restaurant on the west side of South Bend with his wife, Della, Aunt Della. They serve very tasty Harrisburgers, apparently. The Harrises are involved with the local NAACP, local AME church, involved with local politics. They are trusted figures in the community. There are some oral histories that have been done around this team, and consistently we ask about Aunt Della. The players say Aunt Della was great, but she had to run the restaurant and Uncle Bill was off with the team. So again, this kind of hidden women's work that is not often recognized, but at least the players recognize without Aunt Della, there's no Uncle Bill's, there's no Harris's restaurant. But Uncle Bill was a trusted figure in the community. When he tries to recruit Ronaldo Robinson and Annie Weatherspoon and Doris Grady, he goes to their parents, and their parents trust him to take their 15, 16-year-old daughters traveling around the Midwest. He creates various safe spaces for these African-American women. Next slide, Katie. Another fantastic oral history. Edith Paisley was born in Elkhart, Indiana, just east of us, moves to South Bend, hooks up with Uncle Bill's, and this fantastic oral history from 2003 talks about the safe spaces Uncle Bill and his wife create for young African-Americans in South Bend.
Can you describe Uncle Bill's restaurant? What was it like?
Oh, to us it was just a haven because it was a large place on Brickell there. And it was a place of, we felt safe, and with music, it wasn't, the music was nice, and of course it was nice music then. It wasn't this type of music we have now. It was just wonderful, and we would jitterbug and just, had a good time.
When I first clipped this oral history, I wasn't going to include the part about the jitterbugging, but just the lilt in her voice, I think, lets us know how important this place was as a safe space. So this community, everyone knows there's another women's team playing in South Bend at this time. What's the relation to the South Bend Blue Sox and Uncle Bill's, the Hydrox Cola Girls? South Bend Blue Sox, of course, a founding team of the All-American Girls Baseball League, one of two teams in the league from 1943 to 1954. Next slide, Katie. So again, as this crowd probably knows, throughout its existence, the All-American Girls Baseball League does not sign African-American players. There are a handful of Cuban players in the late 40s, but never signed African-American players. This has become a famous source. This is from the All-American Girls Baseball League collection in Hesburgh Libraries, from the Herald Daily Notebooks, a co-owner of the Blue Sox, the minutes from the November 14th meeting. You're probably familiar with this source. The minutes read, "The question of hiring colored players was discussed at length with various views from different cities." I wish they'd elaborate on the various views, but we know how minutes go. "The consensus of the group seemed to be against the idea of colored players unless they would show promise of exceptional ability," which again, we're familiar with that concept. "But in the event the club did hire one of them, none of the clubs would make her feel unwelcome." So next slide, Katie. So the South Bend Blue Sox do have some local black players go to tryouts in the early 50s. Here's a small clipping from the South Bend Tribune. Interestingly, these two players, Elizabeth Jackson, Marie Mazier, never play in Uncle Bill's. We've been able to find out very little about them. They don't show up in the Tribune and other sources. They don't seem to go to South Bend Central High School. Trying to figure out who these players are. They try out. They don't get signed. There's a very contentious, next slide, Katie, please. The relationship between Uncle Bill's and the All-American and the All-American Girls Baseball League is rather contentious. In several of these oral histories, the players and their descendants recall that Uncle Bill's, the Hydrox Cola Girls, do challenge the Blue Sox to some games. The Blue Sox never accept the challenge. And here we'll hear this in the first person testimony of Marguerite Taylor, who's still alive, who's the daughter of Ronaldo Robinson.
His name was Bill Harris. And he had this group of girls, and they traveled. I can remember actually my mother talking about them trying to play the Blue Sox. The Blue Sox would never play them. They were actually very good. And they played surrounding cities. They used to play a team out of Gary often. They played a team out of Michigan City. The Blue Sox never would play them.
So as we know, history is very complicated when we dig into the details. Ronaldo Robinson is one of the through lines of this project, a very important local community member. In 1986, they're trying to build a new stadium in South Bend, then Kovaleski Stadium, now known as Four Winds Field. There's some controversy about the public funding. Renelda Robinson writes this fantastic letter to the editor in February 1986, talking about her experience at Uncle Bill's and how important it was to her. She labels the letter, starts the letter, "Future without hope is no future at all," talking about how important it is to create spaces like Uncle Bill did for young people in the community. Renelda Robinson, after she plays in Uncle Bill's, is a community organizer in South Bend, works for the Housing Authority, works for the Neighborhood Association, founds a food pantry. In 2001, Notre Dame founds the Robinson Community Learning Center in her honor, a local community youth group. Next slide, Katie. This is a project about storytelling. This story has reappeared over the years. The Black community, of course, well knew the story of Uncle Bill's from the 40s to the present time. Other people in South Bend didn't know it as well, but our friend John Kovach in 1987 is just doing his research, writing about Uncle Bill's, writes this fantastic article at South Bend Tribune with these amazing pictures of Doris Grady, Renelda Robinson creating their softball poses, really re-amplifying and bringing the story again to the attention of people in South Bend. 16 years later, the local history center gives Uncle Bill's their Black History Award, an annual award. So we're hoping this project will keep Uncle Bill's, keep these athletes in the public eye, become a part of the fabric of the community so they don't have to be rediscovered by new research every 15 years. And speaking of community, I'll hand it back off to Katie to talk about some of the really cool stuff that's been going on.
Thank you so much, Greg, for moving us through that deep dive on this really fascinating team with incredible women. So like we said at the top of the presentation, part of what we're thinking through in this project is how to get this work out in the community. And we're really grateful to have been able to kind of contract or commission Indianapolis-based artist Ashley Nora to do a mural about this team. And so it was a very cold week in South Bend, but she got to spend a week out here with us. We've got students from around the community. We did another workshop in the background as Ashley was putting the mural in, where folks again got to think about design and creating, but also learning about the stories and the history of these women who quite literally built our community in so many different ways. And so that art ends up on the wall, and here's Ashley painting the mural, which she titled Safe, which echoes so many of the threads that Greg was talking about how the team was a safe place. The adults involved were committed to creating safe spaces for these young women. One of the things that I know Ashley was nervous about is when you paint something where there are living family members, will they see their relatives and their family and their stories in it? And you can see from the smiles of Marguerite Taylor here that things landed in a very happy place. So just the whole mural, again, drawing on the sources that Greg was talking about, honoring the significant role of print media in capturing this history, and particularly the Black press, but also local historians like John Kovach. So just so many different layers going on. So we're not done. There is more space on this wall. So some of the things that we're thinking through now is we know we have a Mexican-American baseball league that was active 50s through 70s, early 2000s, depending on how you track it. But there were also women's teams. So I'm teaching my baseball class this fall at Notre Dame. We're digging into some of this history. Kat, I know you're on the call. We're reading your book next week. It's very exciting. Some of the really big questions that we're thinking through as we open up for questions, just there's a lot going on here. What are folks finding interesting and compelling? We're thinking about how to document and share the work, both from like a public history perspective, but also the kinds of tools or resources that might let folks do this kind of work in your own community with your own baseball and softball stories. I want to give a huge shout out to the design member of our team, Clint Carlson. There are social media things. There is a fantastic website. We really hope that if you ever find yourself in South Bend, you let us know so that we can welcome you to Foundry Field. And with that, thank you all so much. We've got a little bit of time for questions and conversation.
Does anybody have any questions for Katherine and Greg? I'm just seeing so much positive feedback. Go ahead.
Oh, hi. Oh gosh, I'm just overcome at learning all of this. It's so amazing. And to understand that, you know, the research by John Kovach and you teaching from Kat's book in your class, it's all just, you know, part of this big circle that keeps coming back to itself like a Mobius strip of baseball in life, and it's just all so incredibly beautiful. And it kind of reinforces this idea that I got from watching the Amazon iteration of A League of Their Own a couple of years ago when it came out, that there's a very underexplored element to Black women playing baseball or softball, as this project is illuminating. Because one of the characters in that series was a Black woman who played on a factory league team. And it got me thinking, she cannot have been that only one. And that crew that put together that series did some very, very serious research before they even wrote the scripts for that series. So that's why I was thinking about it, that there's probably this a whole facet of Black women baseball players and softball players that so far has been so very underreported about. And projects like this one that put the spotlight on them are just so great.
Carrie,
And
you froze. Oops.
anyway, thank you so much. It's just, I'm just overcome with happiness at learning about this, and that people are interested, and that it reaches out into communities and gets children involved, so that when they become adults, they will pass on that knowledge and that love to, you know, younger people well into the future. And I'm not crying, you're crying.
Carrie, those are beautiful words. And just thank you. I mean, again, I will speak for myself, indebted to the work that many folks on this call have done. Leslie's research, creating spaces to tell different kinds of baseball stories, to argue that that work matters, to create things like the Amazon series, which at some point I will teach a version of my baseball course where it's all about the Amazon series as a starting point. I'm so excited to get to that semester. Greg, I don't know if you want to respond to any of that, but just thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. The more we've dug into this project, there's a team in Gary that an African American women's softball team in Gary that is a rival of Uncle Bill's team. And the more you dig into the sources and start looking for these different stories, they are out there, and some people are starting to tell those stories. And it is an aspect of this history that should be amplified, I think.
Yeah, I'm mindful of time, but I think we can respond really quickly to a question that came in the chat about support from Notre Dame as well as the South Bend community. I can respond to this more fully in the chat, but the short version is we've been really grateful to get support for the artist residencies and the murals through the University of Notre Dame, our Center for Social Concerns, which is doing community engaged learning, restorative justice, among other things. The Capital campaign to build the field had both individual and corporate sponsors from the community. We flashed a slide up there that had a rendering of the scoreboard. We've had a donation from one of our local banks to make the First Source Bank scoreboard at Foundry Field happen. There have also been lots of in-kind partnerships around the construction of the field and parking. And I think this question of the region, we actually had our first baseball game at the field a couple weeks ago. A team from Chicago, Southside, came in. We called it the South Shore Classic, which just makes my heart very happy. Our Boys and Girls Club serves our entire county. But I think these are questions that we're thinking through of just how do we make more connections locally? How do we do that in the region? Because like Greg talked about, this is a regional history in really interesting, complicated ways. Greg, I don't know if you want to respond to that question, but those were my immediate thoughts, being mindful of time.
Yeah, echoing what Katie said, from the beginning, it's been envisioned as a project to involve the communities, particularly involve the youth. The field is right next to Boys and Girls Club. We have Raleigh High School, one of the high schools in South Bend, is a couple blocks away. We have pictures, not in this slide deck, from the Foundry Giants mural opening of the Raleigh High School baseball team standing in front of the Foundry Giants. Very powerful stuff. Lots of restorative justice circles around the teams, around this history. So I see in the chat, we need a baseball card set. Clint Carlson, our design guru on the project, we've been thinking about, he's actually designed a 5-card baseball set for the Foundry Giants with some players and some important sites in South Bend. And we're hoping to scale that up. We're hoping to do, as I think we mentioned, curricular activities around all these teams, so the history becomes sustainable. So we don't have to have a new article in the South Bend Tribune every 15 years rediscovering the Uncle Bills and the Foundry Giants.
Yes, we are excited to talk more with the folks in Rockford. And I think I mentioned it in passing, like the Women's Baseball Heritage Trail has been a real inspiration to think about how we tell the stories, how we invite other people who may not make it to South Bend to learn more about what we're doing. So thank you all.
And we can, as Katie digs into the Latinx women's softball teams, we can certainly share that research as we're doing. And one other comment in the chat. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, I just wanted to say, I see a home and away series. What do you think? Higher?
I like this.
Thank you guys.
Thank
This
you.
was awesome.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so
Thanks, Phil.
much, Catherine and Greg.